again. Welcome back to Requiem Radio. You're being hosted by Hazy Dialects. Unfortunately, Solo cannot be here today due to some unforeseen circumstances. He'll have to deal with that, but he'll be back next week. This is your usual other co-host of the podcast, your favorite schizo on Twitter, who is spontaneously online, but spontaneous not online, the self-loathing narcissist himself, Hazy Dialects, and I'm with here today with Chuck McBeef Chest, one of the most hilarious names and someone who's a jovial person to discuss and to engage in in-depth conversations about Japan, news of that nature, and someone who is very versed in combatant sports since he has been training there for quite some time and even moved out there to explore those expertise even further. He can elaborate far more than I can with this, but he also has his own show, which he will enlighten you on now. But before that, how are you doing today? And thank you for joining us for Record Radio.
Oh, good. It's morning for me. I think it's evening for you.
Sun gone now. It's 8 o'clock.
Oh, it's 8 o'clock at night. Yeah. So it's 9 o'clock in the morning in Japan. So I'm just getting my day going. It's awesome. Yeah, I host a show called Ninja News Japan. It is, as the title would tell you, news from Japan. I do a lot of editorialization though. So you get a lot of my opinion and my view on Japanese culture in Japan in the show. I do another show called C McBee, which is the shortened version of my name, Chuck McBeef Chest. Recently, if you go on YouTube, you can get C McBee IMDb, which is my mystery science theater style reaction videos to old movies. I published a kids book at the end of last year, and I'm working on my second one right now. Just trying to put as much stuff out into the world as humanly possible all the time.
Fascinating. When it comes to joining, all right, so we talk about a lot of mediums, and for someone who does a lot of editing, writing, as well as a bit of reviews for different mediums, it's interesting in terms of how different types of skills you would require or even need to engage in it. But I would like to ask you in particular, what about traveling into those different avenues and ventures is most appealing to you?
Um, I I think maybe it starts with I just get bored very easily. So I always want to make stuff. And if I want to make stuff, I want to try to make something I haven't made before. My original thing was writing. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a writer. I always enjoyed writing stuff. When the early 2000s, I was writing a blog like I think everyone else was. I if you checked like hits and stuff, the numbers were always huge, but I'm sure that is not reflective of how many people were actually going to the site. But I realized pretty early on that most people don't read in depth, which as someone who wanted to write stuff, it was kind of like, well, then what's the point of writing a 2-page essay if no one's going to read the 2-page essay? And that's when I discovered podcasting. Podcasting to me, if someone's going to listen to the podcast, they're probably going to listen to the whole thing. So if you check your statistics for retention rate, I think 80% of the people listen to the whole episode. You can see a huge drop off when you hit the like end theme song if you put that in. But that shows that there's an engagement level there that is significant, which means the content you're creating, the stuff you're making, people are actually taking in, and there's a satisfaction there. So it's probably a much smaller number. If I put a post on the internet, maybe 1 million people see it, but they only read the title. They only like superficially scan some of the first paragraph and then they move on. I did have a job as a video game reviewer for about 3-4 years. And in comments, which it became very important to respond to people who were commenting on the article, it became really clear that people didn't read past the first paragraph. And so that was really disheartening. But when I got into podcasting, it was a new medium and it was something I wanted to learn. So I had to learn about microphones and editing software and all the stuff that comes with it, how to upload, how to create an RSS feed. And I tried to automate all of that. And so that was all just learning process. So for me, it was like, here's a new thing. I can learn all about it and continue to create stuff, which is what I really want to do. But there was a real satisfaction. Well, yeah, maybe 30,000 people skim an article. Only 100 people listen to a podcast, but they listen to the whole thing. And so that depth of engagement was much more appealing. So that to me was the appeal of podcasts. people were telling me, "Oh, you got to put your face on it and put it on YouTube." And I've never wanted to do that. But I did. I didn't find any success in the YouTube channel for the podcast, but that led me to have the ability to create other channels which have started to be more successful. So like I mentioned, the C McBee IMDb, I'm primarily watching old kung fu movies and just making jokes about them. But I wouldn't have been able to do that as easily if I hadn't learned the editing skills from the other thing. So I think it's just, yeah, there's a drive to create and a drive to learn. And you put those together, you're going to end up doing something pretty interesting most of the time.
Um, Something I spiritually connected with what you said earlier is how people don't really pay attention to what is being written, which is very fascinating and entertaining to some regard, but also equally infuriating considering when it comes to essayists in general and trying to figure out what it means to create a particular idea, often enough, or trying to convey a particular idea and be mindful of the idea to the end. So it doesn't get lost or it's continuously reiterated upon and carried through the entire work in of itself. So the problem sometimes for me is how people don't seem mindful of that, or there's something they have a knee-jerk reaction to only for the thing they're discussing within the comment sections in of itself to be addressed within the video or essay in of itself, whether written or audible. So that's kind of comedic sometimes to me. It's equally infuriating as it is. For example, just to briefly touch upon it, there are some experiences I remember having a while back ago when addressing DEI, and how some
Yeah.
people seem to discuss the decline of a particular idea, product, or like IP due to a prioritization of diversity, equality, and inclusivity within a work, and seem to believe that the assertion of these ideas are what is causing the work to diminish in quality. However, I don't believe there's any way to truly ascertain that, given the fact that the markers of these ideas is simply just a commentary they fundamentally disagree with. Some I which necessarily doesn't speak towards the quality of the work in of itself. As example being like the Ghostbusters reboot, some people had such a criticisms of its execution, its humor, its story, its narrative, and how the characters interacted with each other and how they didn't find them liking. However, my biggest problem and criticism of this is that that doesn't necessarily mean that the Ghostbusters in of itself cannot work just with a gender swap versions of these characters. Unless you would have to commit yourself to the notion and belief that the crux of the issue has to be the decision to do so. And some people seem to cushion themselves with the idea that it has nothing to do with their gender. It's a prioritization of it, but there's so many stories that we know of, even rarely from aliens, and how flippant the decision to make her a woman at the last choice was just arbitrary. There was no need to do so. But you'll have a comment from somebody and say, "Here we go again," or calling people sexist for not liking a movie. I'm like, so you didn't read it. So you just didn't read it.
Well,
So you
it's
just
the internet is reactive and they're looking, again, the algorithm and everything, it pushes controversy, it pushes people being divisive more than anything else. Because I remember when they made, so if I can go back in my memory and look at all the like most recent ones, so the Doctor Who becoming a woman, and people were outraged, and it's like, but if you change your body every 5 years in the Doctor Who universe, you're going to be a woman sooner or later. That actually makes perfect sense. And then Miles Morales, people are like, oh, it's not Spider-Man. It's like, well, no, it's not Spider-Man. It's Miles Morales. He's a different character. And people were upset about that. And then you go back to Lady Thor, and Thor's not a lady, and everyone's upset. I mean, Miles Morales is probably the best Spider-Man who's come out, like one of the best characters who's come out in recent history. Lady Thor is really interesting. They did those old comics where it was like alternate histories, where it was Superman landed in Russia instead of America. What would that be like? The comic medium, I think, is designed to play with the characters. That's the whole point. But I can remember when Daniel Craig was introduced as James Bond, and people were upset that he had blonde hair. And I mean, that's how stupid and minor and how reactive these people are going to be because they're looking for something to be upset about. It's like James Bond has black hair. It's like, dude, there's no way that matters. And then Daniel Craig comes out, does his movie, and everyone likes him because he did a good job. And then the conversation about people going like, "Oh, Idris Elba could not be James Bond. He would be an awesome James Bond. He's a bit old now to start, but if they'd gone back 10, 15 years and started then, he would have been amazing because just he's demonstrated he has that charm and that ability to do all the things that a James Bond would need to do." But I think the internet, because it pushes up all those controversies and negative feelings and reactive things, you get down to like, you go back historically and look at some of the controversies and you'll see how small and stupid they get. And it's just people just looking for outrage constantly.
Absolutely. It's quite humorous how dedicated and passionate fans can be about particular IP or work and believe that there are rigid rule principles you absolutely have to adhere to in order for it to be the work in of itself, despite them not being the people who worked on the work itself and not being the creators of the work itself. It's a thing I understand about people who are the creators of said ideas and their vision. But if they gave their IP and stories to a company to use, they have relinquished with hope their restraints in a sort of what can and cannot be pushed in terms of the boundaries of this character. They are giving away the ability and giving permission to other writers to explore that character. So it often perplexes me when people say something to the effect of, "This is not my Joker or my Batman," despite the fact that sometimes in times when you were introduced to the character, it was during a period where it wasn't even conceptually who had initially created the character. Some people back in the day, it seems like heresy nowadays that Batman doesn't wear black, but Batman wore blue when initially was introduced. He was more campy. He was akin to an Adam West type of caricature, and we talk about him. But now he's the Dark Knight, which is again a re-envision of his character and has become one of the most popular iterations of his character. So it's kind of fascinating how people are so hell-bent to believing that there are obelisks in terms of do's and don'ts of particular characters, despite the fact that the Justice League is often accompanied by a Flash and a Green Lantern. Say a Flash and a Green Lantern, since the Green Heart and the original Flash aren't even a part of the roster that we typically think of when we look at the Justice League. Wally West is not the OG Flash. Hal Jordan, despite being one of the most popular Green Lanterns, is not even that. And even in the early 2000s TV show, we had Jon Stewart, which grew up around that time period. They had their parents come through like, oh shoot, they have a black Green Lantern, which they grew up with Hal Jordan. They didn't grow up with Jon Stewart. But for many people who are getting to the series, Justice League, that would be the first Green Lantern. So I believe that sometimes it's kind of humorous and almost cartoonishly absurd at times when people talk about IPs and the core tenets as to what you can and cannot explore when it comes to ideas. When sometimes the idea you've been introduced to and the IP you understand it as to now is nowhere near a reflection of what it was in terms of its origins.
Well, it'd be actually really funny if if you went back and said, "Okay, we're going to stick to only the originals." You would have that original campy Batman, and everyone would hate him now because they do want the evolution. They just don't realize it. Like they
Absolutely.
the absolute silliness of the original Batman, and then if you want to take it into the TV show where they had, I mean, the classic for me was the anti-shark spray. And he just pull anything out of his utility belt, and it was all a joke. But I mean, the whole thing was a joke. And now they want their dead serious Batman who is all scowly all the time. But they don't seem to realize like that was an evolution, and that thing that they like right now. Oh, we want the original. Well, the original is a goof who has a rainbow colored set of suits. He's got a yellow one and a blue one and an orange one, and they all look really silly. But yeah, people, it's just that again, reactive. I've grown up with this thing that I know. In my lifetime, because I when I was a kid, it was the original Battlestar Galactica. I think it was the 70s. And I remember watching those, and they're terrible TV shows. Like I liked it because it was the only thing in space on TV at the time. And I just would take in anything that had space in it. The reboot comes out and they've gender swapped a character, but now that character is way better than the original one. Like all the original characters, again, it was sort of a 70s kind of cheesy TV show. This gritty reboot where they gender swap some characters, 100 times better. No one would actually say it's an inferior thing. And I would say it's better for some of the gender swaps because they get to explore more interactions between the characters. I would absolutely say like, yeah, get rid of the old one, get rid of the original and give me a new one. And I would like to see that more and more things. Like there should be more experimentation and more trying different stuff because that's the whole point of fiction. Like they seem to be getting away from the idea of what a fiction is. It's fiction is something that I made up. And okay, well, I made up this. And I would actually wouldn't be surprised if original authors were like, yeah, I want to see what other people do with it. Maybe I want to take my character that I created and I want to change it and do something else with it. Because that's again, that's part of the creative process. It's fun. If you're just going to make one thing and just stick to it, that would get really boring and repetitive for me.
Absolutely, and absolutely. There's some people who could look at a story, and that's why I think what you brought up was a very good point. The arbitrarity of invoking the true version of a show or the real version or the OG version is most of the time period not even the thing that it was when you encountered it. It's the version that became popular during the time period when you got engaged with it. I think most people probably couldn't imagine Star Trek without Captain James, but some people couldn't imagine Star Trek without Captain Picard. There are in terms of like that reactive and knee-jerk reaction of not allowing something to be its own thing versus the incessant need to compare it to something else without allowing it to convey what it is and what its vision is. I can tell you that I love Batman Forever for what it was. Batman Forever is still one of my favorite movies ever. I love its campiness. I love the bat skates. I love the boarding. I love Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze, because I believe that if you're going to go campy, why not go whole hell? Why not just have these characters say the most bizarre one-liners? Why not have a Batman credit card? The movie inherently feels like it's trying to be campy, and I feel like you can only suffer, only not enjoy it if you're trying to apply the Batman animated series. If you were introduced to the Batman animated series and thus believe that everything after it had to abide by the rules of that verse, then of course you're not going to enjoy it and you're going to believe it to be satirization or even bastardization of the IP. But it simply isn't. It's its own thing. It's its own universe. The beauty of that is allowing it to exist as its own thing.
Well, this is when people then, if you don't change the character, you don't evolve at all, they start to complain that it's just repetition. Because that comes up in video games a lot where people are like, "Oh, this iteration of whatever video game series, it's really just the same with more stuff tacked on." And they complain about that. But then if you give them a brand new video game, they would complain about that. 'Cause I still want my old video game. So it's almost like there's no satisfaction. Again, I think we're just talking about the noise of the internet. 'Cause the
True,
internet
true.
just whatever you do, it's gonna react negatively to it. It's gonna go through that. And
Wait,
it's
yeah.
we get into the point where it's like, you really just gotta if you don't like it, don't watch it or don't play it or don't do it. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I on, one of my YouTube channels, it was just getting started, and this guy came in, probably a troll, but he just goes like, "I basically don't like what you're doing here." And in my head, I'm like, "Well, then why are you commenting? Like, just move on. Like, you don't need to watch it. It's free entertainment." That's also the thing that gets me more than anything else. Like, I can understand a little bit if you pay for something and you're not satisfied with the product, but so much of content is on the internet is free. So, what are you complaining about? Just like, "Oh, I didn't like that, move on." And yet they have to feel like, "I didn't like that, so I have to tell people that I didn't like that." That becomes important. It's like, you just watched a free YouTube video, you just listened to a free podcast. If you didn't like it, turn it off, move on. No one cares. It's fine.
I'm all for criticisms, especially constructive criticisms, but some people make it sound like, "Oh, that's 2 hours of my life I'm never getting back," as if someone had themselves strapped to a chair, or you provided me nothing insightful, or where I was misinformed to the topics or the myriad of discussions that do transpire on my platform. What was the purpose of even commenting this? It's that sort of hilarity that definitely ensues. But speaking of And culturally, I think that sometimes people love to engage with rage bait. Some people aspire or presumably love to self-proclaim themselves as apolitical, but constantly find themselves surprisingly, suspiciously enough, inundating their audience with criticisms of overtly left-leaning or extremist left-leaning content curators or people or individual, and then say, "This is not me. I'm going either way. I'm just trying to be honest about what the average person is." And there is sometimes truth to that, but it definitely makes you raise an eyebrow. Or for some people who attempt to speak about culturally what Japan is, and sometimes you often find out they use words like baka within their sentences, or the sentence structure is more akin to an English speaker once you put it through translate. So it calls into question the validity and earnest experiences within Japan. Speaking of which, I would like to just discuss that with you actually in terms of your experiences in Japan. How has it been as of lately? Most people are speaking as outsiders, but I think that social media allows people to speak as an authority without any sort of scrupulousness to it all or any verification. Say what you will about traditional media, the newspaper or even TV. There was some form of feathering and accountability as to the platform. If somebody had been found out to be a fraud or had been faking their credentials, they would have been removed off the air, no longer provided a platform. Now, the lack of severity of just spreading misinformation or telling overt lies is little to no form of accountability. While I believe it's kind of funny, sorry for the bit of a tangent, but I just found that to be a bit humorous how people often lecture traditional media, but traditional media probably has the most palpable forms of actual repercussions for the behaviors and actions, such as actually losing your job. But yes, if you could just inform the audience, since most people don't have an insight or a person who actually resides within the country telling them or informing them about what actually transpired there and how it is living.
Well, because I've lived in Japan since 2001 now, so it's been like 23 years. So, I'm a permanent resident. I have a house, I have a wife, I have kids, like I have a family, like I have the whole a life is here. This is just now my home as far as I'm concerned. So I live a very normal life, and I work with people who come to the country, and you have similar experiences on a regular basis with people who are new to the country because there's the shock that Japan is not what they imagined. I work in a city called Nagoya. It's the third biggest city in Japan. When a lot of people come to Japan, they're thinking Tokyo. They're not thinking Japan, the country. Their image of Japan is just Tokyo. It's the big city with those lights, and it's all the neon and all that other stuff. And that is Tokyo, and it is the downtown of a couple of big cities, but that is not what the average experience of Japan is if you don't live in Tokyo. And even people
Similarly,
live.
would you say, oh, sorry, didn't mean to
No, go
interrupt
ahead.
you.
Go
I
ahead.
was adding on to what you were saying. Would you say that it's similar to people who want to travel to Vegas, but the only exposure to Vegas is just the strip?
Yes. I mean, that is exactly the same thing. So like if you talk to someone about, oh yeah, we went to Las Vegas, they stayed in a hotel and they went down one road. They went down one street, the main strip. We went to 3 casinos. We went to Vegas. And it's like, no, you saw part of it, I'm sure, but you didn't go to the outskirts. You didn't go to the desert. You didn't go to any of the other exciting stuff. Um, yeah, a lot of people their insular view is from media, which is I think how we experience a lot of things. And so some people feel a significant disappointment that Japan isn't meeting their expectations. And then some people are excited by the idea that, oh, there's a lot more to this than I thought. And so it really depends what you came here for. So we get, of course, all the cliches. We get like the anime nerds who come here and they think everyone's into anime. Anime in Japan is common, but it's still a subculture. So like the very serious anime people, that's still a subgroup. That's not like the average person. The average person probably does watch anime and maybe reads comics and stuff, but not to the level that an anime person, an anime fan, otaku would actually experience. So, like, if I went to my wife and I said, "Are you into anime?" She might actually say no, but she watches Conan. Conan's on like every single week. She watches like 3 or 4 different animes regularly. Probably just the most popular ones, but it's because they're popular because that's what a lot of people like. But then if you said, "Are you into anime?" She'd probably say no, because in her mind, watching 1 or 2 isn't the same category as someone who's into anime, which is all they do. Because Japan, the phrase otaku, um, it's like an obsessive fan. So there's a categorical difference to what it is. I like anime. I watch it if it comes up. I'm not opposed to it. I like some, but I would never be called an otaku because I don't watch it exclusively, and that's sort of the difference in the feeling. There's a kind of a thing in Japan where if someone's into something, that's their whole life. And it's almost this weird obsessive aspect of the culture of Japan. And it sort of it feeds into like the work culture where you work and you do nothing else. And then an experience I went through with my daughter is she was doing gymnastics. I just wanted her to do something, have fun, dance around, be flexible, just exercise. I didn't actually care if she was good at it. I just wanted her to have fun. And then she got to, I believe it was about 10. And then they came to us and said, "Oh, well, she's going up to the next level. You have to bring her 5 days a week." And I'm like, "Well, actually, I work and my wife works, so we can't physically bring her 5 days a week." And then they're like, "Well, then you have to quit." I'm like, "We can't just bring her once or twice a week to have a good time with her friends?" And they're like, "No, if you're at this level, if you're going to do gymnastics, you're going to do nothing else. You're only going to do gymnastics." I'm like, "Dude, I don't even want her to go to the Olympics. I just want her to have fun and be sort of flexible and healthy." And they were just like, "Well, we don't have a class for that." I'm like, "How can you not have a thing for kids to have fun?" But it's that if you're going to do something, you're going to do it 100%, which is good and bad because it leads to this obsessiveness, but it also leads to like burnout and people being overwhelmed and people quitting stuff they love. But I think if you're going to find there's kind of like a cliche. If you're going to find someone who's good at something, there's like an Asian kid who's better at it. But that's burned into the culture where if you're gonna like play guitar, you're gonna be the best guitar player in the world. If you're gonna play chess, you're gonna try to be the best chess player in the world. And all the manga supports that as a storyline is so consistent. Like, I'm gonna learn how to fight. I'm gonna be the best fighter in the world, and I'm gonna get defeated, and then I'm gonna stand up and I'm gonna train harder and I'm gonna get better. And that message is just constant because I think that is part of the culture. But I think I actually got way off track. People
No,
coming to Japan
I
for their
agree with what you're
experience.
saying there. I do
Yeah.
agree with what you're saying there. I realize that otaku and even the hikikomoro otaku are people who are not only isolating themselves, are people who don't really live a life outside of their passions and their obsessions about a particular medium, but it's not something that is looked upon as term of particularly endearment. It's merely a way to describe their infatuation with medium in of itself. Whereas in America, we look at, oh, if you're otaku, they're describing it as, oh, you're someone within the vast array and a source of knowledge about a particular. Whereas in Japan, if I'm correct in saying so, they're saying, oh, you're somebody who's very obsessed with this.
Yeah, so if I called someone an otaku, there's an element of insult to that. Because I've the reason I came to Japan was because I practiced judo. I've practiced judo since I was 12. So basically my whole life. I've done judo. I got really good at it, and then sort of like there's not really a career path for people who do judo. There's no famous judo people. So there's no life there, but I still wanted to pursue it. And I ended up in Japan because I wanted to do a couple of years of judo in Japan. But because I do other stuff, like again, I do content creation, I do podcasts, I do videos, I'll write, and then I have other interests. No one would ever call me an otaku, even though that would probably be the main drive in my life, and it's how I ended up with the life I have now. They still wouldn't say I'm an otaku because that's not all encompassing of my life. Whereas an anime otaku, only thing they care about is anime. And then the like densho otaku, the train otaku guys, all they want to do is spend all their time taking pictures of trains and talking about trains and being on trains. And they have it for everything. Like there's baseball otaku and everything else, but there is most of it's quite light. So if I said he's a baseball otaku, I'd say like, oh, he loves baseball. But if I said like he's a densho otaku, I'm like, no, he's obsessive. Like he hears a train and he'll stop what he's doing and be like, that's whatever serial number that train is.
Yeah, and I did not know that actually, that there are just train fanatics actually spend the time figuring out like trains. And I didn't know that it was even something that was a type of hobbyist.
Oh, yeah, no, it's huge. The train fanatic dudes are a whole other level because they, will sit down and, like so, like, a train will come around a curve, and then there's a certain moment where you can get a picture of the whole train. There's a story, it was pre-pandemic, so, like, 5, 6 years ago, of 20, 30 of these guys had set up where they were going to take picture of this train at this exact moment. And this guy just happened to ride his bicycle around and ruin the picture. And he very jauntily waved his hand to all the like otaku guys. And they were furious and they were threatening to beat him up. And they were like, you should compensate us because we didn't get that picture. And they were like basically threatening this guy. And then there's been incidences in Japan where like people, the densha otaku guys, they'll push people out of the way because they want to get the right picture. So the equivalent to me right now is the fitness influencers where they set up their camera and someone walks in front of the camera and they get like furious at them. It's at a higher level than that because you think for a fitness influencer, they could do that move again and do a second take. For these train guys, the train pulling in only happens once. So if they don't get that specific picture, they'll never get that picture again. Maybe on that day at that time with this weather or whatever they're trying to get. And they travel around on trains and they memorize all the trains, and the trains are really important. But that's little Japanese kids, boys primarily, they fall in love with trains really early because it's one of the primary modes of transportation. So, like most little kids, boys, most of the time, they're into cars, they're into trucks, they're into like machines. In Japan, because trains are the primary mode of transportation for most people, there's trains everywhere. So you see them. And so for a kid, that's a pretty exciting thing. And so they grow up with it. And my son went through it. He could name all the trains. And then when he got to about 7 or 8, it kind of trailed off and he got interested in other stuff. But some people never grow out of it. It just becomes their whole life and they just love trains more than anything. But that again sort of feeds into Japan has this drive and punishment of obsessive culture where, you should be obsessed about stuff and it should be really important, but then also it can always go too far, which is where you end up with these situations. You mentioned hikikomori. This is sometimes it's because of social awkwardness, but recently they've been finding it comes from the social pressure of school or the social or bullying at work. And so there does seem to be still a lot of bullying in Japan. It becomes one of the primary social issues for teens, and it's one of those things that is sort of universal. But in Japan, as you know, bullying kind of hits to the next level. It seems like a pretty common thing, and if that goes on into your adult life, like you finish school, you get a job, and you start getting bullied at work, it's like, what is society worth? I don't want to actually ever go out and participate again. And that's how you get these guys who just like stay home. And then Japan being one of those cultures where you live at home probably until you get married, maybe even after, depending on the size of your parents' house and stuff. Your parents are probably willing to support you. Uh, you can't find a job, they're okay. We're gonna let you live free. Uh, I always get frustrated by that because I'm like, well, that's enabling this behavior, but then they're looking at a different way like, well, he's bullied at school, bullied at work, how can I kick him out of my house? Like, it's just too much. Society's too much. And then you got uh kids who are like who have autism or something like that, and they don't generally fit into society, whereas society in Japan is very conformist oriented, and they need a different kind of school, and their at-home schooling is actually proving to be so. Like when the pandemic hit and online school became relatively common, those kids started to flourish, and so they've found that okay, maybe not everyone has a single track of how to be successful, and that is a revelation to Japan. It's still not happening as much as it should, but I think a generation down the line, when the people growing into positions of education and stuff, they're like, I grew up with people who flourished online and didn't do as well in person. Maybe we should make that an option. I think that's going to be coming in the future. Japan's still very strict and very old fashioned, so it takes a long time to change anything.
What you just said there was very interesting to me, considering the fact that I don't think people really realize how much, um, well, 2 things, because I do enjoy when you put a lot on my plate to engage with. I think it's very fascinating how there's a very thin line between being obsessive and dedicated.
Yeah,
They're interested in giving you tutelage, but only if they believe you passionate enough to give up or forgo everything in life or just other hobbies to refine your abilities because they see that you do have a spark and you do have a skill level. And they're saying, for this skill level, we are willing to train and give you tutelage only if you're willing to dedicate yourself exclusively to this, which starts to highlight and elevate the perspective in which some shows seem to convey the idea and concept of losing. Because it isn't just simply a hobby or something you're good at, it's the only thing you've dedicated exclusively all your time to doing and refining your ability to do so. So losing holds a greater magnitude and weight to these people than just, oh, I just lost something out. I'm good at it, but it's not my whole life. It's something
Yeah,
that,
you've
yeah,
lost, like, you've lost the thing you've given your life to. Like, I've you every Japanese sport, the loser is crying. And I'm like, but so again, I have to relate everything to judo because it's the thing I know most about. But I'm like, in judo, you fight constantly. So you win and lose constantly. You just can't win all the time. And it's like, how are you taking it that hard, man? You're like, you've won 100 fights, you've lost 50. You're in the plus, but it's for them is again, it's that dedication, that level. And it's frustrating because it breaks people. Like, I've seen lots and lots of guys, young guys come in, they wanna do judo, they enjoy it, and then it's one of those classic, like, their dad has a dream of and he's just shouting at them from the side, and he's making them hate it, and I'm like, as soon as this kid gets out of high school and can choose whether or not to continue, he's gonna quit, because there's just too much pressure, and he's not having fun, and that is where they lose an element of, how is it I'm super old, I'm, like, 52 now, I'm still doing judo. I'm teaching classes. I'm still going every week. How is that possible when everyone else is quit in their 30s? I'm like, well, because I like it. And that's never gone away because I never had that pressure. Like, my family didn't understand judo. Like, they're like, I don't get why you enjoy slamming people into the ground or vice versa, getting slammed into the ground because it seems like it happens a lot. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's part of the practice. But there's a community there that I really meshed with. And then as I grew up and sort of went from place to place, I found that community was everywhere. So for me, it made it very easy for me to travel because everywhere I went, I had an inherent support system. I could go find the local judo club. They'd help me find whatever I need to find. They suddenly were like already all my friends because we all practice the same thing. But there was a joy there that I had constantly. And the obsessiveness is what takes out a lot of the joy and a lot of the pleasure for people, which is why, again, either they burn out or it breaks them or they just can't go on. And the more extreme cases, you get these guys who, again, the shut-ins, society has just, there's too much pressure. And so the pressure in Japan, especially Japan and Korea during education, is just off the charts. Like, Korea has the highest teen suicide rate in the world, and it's always during September, which is exam season. In Korea, they stop airplanes during exams, like they stop flights. In Japan, they have exam season, and you just see these kids are just super stressed out. And it's, as someone who like, I was not particularly academic. I went to university and stuff, but I never really, I knew that wasn't really my world. I did it because I felt like I had to. Uh, but that also meant I didn't take it very seriously, so I had a really good time, and I'm just not seeing that with kids in Japan. Like, it's just there's so much pressure, and I'm like, that pressure is taking away a lot of the joy of being young, and that's sort of a lot of the problems with Japan as a culture. Because if you listen to Ninja News Japan, I talk about, like, because they're talking about the birth rate is dropping significantly. They're not gonna have enough babies to sustain the population, and what do we do? And I'm like, well, how about you let people finish work and go out and meet other people and go out and have dates and stuff? Like, they seem to be missing how babies are made. It's two people have time to meet each other, they date, and then they maybe progress into a relationship, or they break up and then they find other people to have relationships with. They seem to be missing that completely. And they keep coming up with these government programs and schemes. I'm like, government programs are not going to make you date someone. These plans aren't going to make you actually form a relationship with another human being. What you need is free time. And they just don't do that. Because again, like my example with my daughter, 5 days a week, I'm like, maybe she wants to do something else, man.
what you said is amazing. I think that's also the reason why roulette dating or the dating soirees that America doesn't work very well. While I understand the sentiment and I appreciate what they're trying to do, I think the amount of time and effort as well as the pressure to like succeed is kind of a lot. Whereas I think that most people get into relationships when there's a situation of ease. Like dating roulette, most people probably sucks because for them it's like, oh, a rejection on rotation. Like I constantly have to introduce myself, had to figure out whether or not I know the person well enough. I get like an hour's worth of time to figure out whether or not I want to talk to them, and that doesn't feel like a healthy way to like get to know somebody. There's a pressure, and that pressure just I don't think it lends itself to a naturally healthy growing relationship. As to another thing I thought was interesting, what you brought up here, is that I was somebody who was introduced the majority of Japan culture, through Toonami, through anime, and as I got older, I started to realize how much of Japan had a prevalent, like, bullying problem. Like, yeah, bullying is extreme and, crippling and harsh, but I think that often enough that, like, something that can be seen as an absurdism within a particular fiction or medium is often expressing a crucial or far harsher reality that, like, might be more grounded, but it's similarly harsh in different ways. I think when I started exploring more of Japan's medium, and as in drama shows, TV shows, and just commentaries in general, I'm like, oh wow, bullying actually has a pervasiveness in almost all of their commentaries, storylines, and narratives. It's actually there and other things existing outside of just the medium I was predominantly watching at the time. So I was like, if that is the case, then Japan really does have a actual bullying. It's similarly when I found out about, since people often describe Japan, I know that Japan has luxurious places to visit, lavish vegetation, some of the most iconic places to ever visit if you're ever around there. In fact, I go as far as to say that I do have a bit of fanaticism when it comes to Japan. I follow multiple channels that just tell me about visiting places that are around there because I do intend on going there and making my trips and plans to visit there. But I do think that sometimes people seem to look at it as a passion of flawlessness or idealism that comes from social media tourists that have never stepped foot in Japan. For instance, I think that the exclusive gendered oriented buses speak towards the inability to um, hinder the amount of unwanted harassment that occurs on buses and trains. So to have to ameliorate the issue by just saying we're going to have to some separate the sexes seems to be a big issue, at least in terms of offering that as a solution to the problem in of itself.
Yeah, I remember when they introduced women only train cars, and I was like, of course, because if you've read more than one story of a woman being like, I actually was reading one yesterday, and it was a guy, and he basically the trains get really crowded, especially in Tokyo. Like you actually have to be touching the people around you because there's so many people packed in. So what these guys do is they drop their hands down, they just start feeling up women. And that can last for two train stops, one train stop or two train stops. So it's like 5, 10, 15 minutes and you can't escape. There's almost nothing you can do. They need to normalize the woman saying something. But again, because of it's a cultural thing, they are shocked into silence. And then it's afterwards when sort of the surprise has dissipated, the shock has dissipated, that they will go to the police or they'll report it or something. This is another one where they try to come up with systems. They actually have like it's not like a silent alarm, but it's like something you could show people, and it's because the guy's almost always going to be behind you. Um, Something you could show the person standing in front of you, like someone's trying to touch me right now. It's called chika in Japanese, and it's just like these are the guys who get on the trains and they try to like molest people. That's common enough that a woman's only train. I was like, absolutely makes perfect sense because if it's dangerous, you got to make a safe space for them. And of course, a bunch of guys were upset, and I'm like, that you're actually telling on yourself because any reasonable guy is going to be like, if they're getting touched on the train, give them their own train car makes perfect sense. If you're saying that that's unfair, like I have no problem with a guy's only train with smells worse or whatever. Like I have no problem with that separation if there's a reason. And then it's pervasive. So like when you say bullying, yeah, bullying's pervasive as a cultural problem, but it's starting to come to the forefront over the last couple of years. The pandemic has actually seemed to push a lot of changes because people are like, uh, I I don't want to feel this stress all the time, and it's almost like the added stress of the pandemic changed something. The young people coming up, they aren't putting up with it a lot. And so there's a lot of stories of how they, again, in Japanese, they have every kind of harassment gets labeled. So there's power harassment, sexual harassment. They have maternity harassment. They have, well, that's so like a woman wants to take time off to have a baby, which is legally protected, and they try to push her into quitting because they have to spend technically the company's money to support her when she's not actually working. Recently, I don't know if it's a serious one, but they're talking about like smell harassment, where it's just like people who don't take care of themselves properly and they're in a social setting. Because most offices in Japan are open concept. And the open concept office means like if I smell bad, everyone around me can smell me. But then there's noise harassment, all these kind of things. Now that they're getting labels, I think the labels are a bit silly, but it shows that as a society, they're starting to be conscious of there are issues that we need to address. And this is one of the ways they're going about addressing them.
As people were, I think the pandemic really gave people a bit of perspective in which what was typically thought to be normal was kind of a psychological conditioning. But as you spend further and longer away from those things, there's a instance and moment where you start to evaluate that and ask yourself, do you want to be subjected to it since you've gone so long without being subjected to it? Do I want to put myself through that again? There has to be something that has to change. And I think sometimes people socially, even in terms of social obligations, I think people start to reevaluate what matters more to them since they went without and they had a long enough time to be picky about who they wanted to talk to, who they wanted to interact with, what they wanted to engage with socially speaking. I think now reintegrating with society, it gave them a perspective of lacking that necessity or feeling that they ought to. When it came to a lot of things in society, one of the worst things about harassment and bullying is that often enough is not overt. It is done in ways that are passive aggressive, needlessly cruel in ways that, if pointed out, can sometimes feel like you're just being paranoid. And then there's that deliberation in which you have to essentially wait for an instance where it's so overt that you can then call it out or retaliate in such a way where you're forcing the other individual to say something that makes it very candid what is occurring before you. Even in America, there was those instances where somebody said something that feels really passive aggressive or clowning on you in a way where they're just attempting to make you seem kind of crazy for interacting with it. I think the best example of that, and one of the most immediate ones that come to mind, is when Drake released a bunch of old videos of him interacting with people, a legendary collection of before his rise to the megastar he is nowadays. He had interaction with The Weeknd, and in this video, there are a collective group of other celebrities there, and he shakes their hand, he hugs them, and he engages in casual conversation. However, he does not directly say hi to The Weeknd. Towards the end of the conversation, he then claps him up. And in this instance, you can kind of see where the paranoia of someone's hostility can come to play. But if you call it out, you're in a situation where you just look like you're being paranoid or needlessly controversial, antagonistic for no reason. So it's like, "Oh, he did say hi to you, so what do you have a problem with? He did say hi to you." It's like, yeah, but explicitly took his time to not interact with me or engage with me, despite the fact that I was in front of him like everybody else was. Why did he do it like that? You know what I mean? It's kind of like one of those instances. But I'm not informed enough to speak towards Japan harassment, but I think that the idea that is uncouth and very inappropriate to be as loud or as much of a nuisance to basically people's peace. It's inappropriate. You just sort of have a collective respect for people, which is why streamers are often chastised or even physically harassed for how loud and belligerent they are at times and how much of a nuisance they have been to the culture as of recently for the purposes of spectacle. But, if you could, speak towards it just a small, bit, how does harassment in Japan usually flesh out, and how does it usually form?
Because it depends what kind. Because really, when you're talking about society, you're going to be either talking about bullying, so it's going to be power harassment at work. So it's going to be your boss puts too much pressure on you, is constantly berating you. Again, there is sort of still the hierarchy structure within society, so you don't talk back to your boss. bosses, again, we're going to go traditionally. It's probably an older man. My boss is actually a woman who's the same age as me, but our relationship, just by that very dynamic being different and me being foreigner and her being a woman, the dynamic's just different altogether. So I've never experienced something like that. Also, I'm big scary man, so it's pretty hard to power harass me. But the traditional version in Japan, again, sort of the news stories I read, and they stand you up, again, open concept office. They bring you up to the front. The way the offices are almost always laid out, it's sort of like rows of employees, and the boss is sitting at the end of a row with his desk facing the whole room. So the boss calls you up to the desk, and then they just start shouting at you, or they just start insulting you. They start calling you stupid or whatever. That would be almost a cliche, but it's a cliche because that has and does happen. And on Ninja News Japan, we do harassment stories all the time, bullying in the workplace. But bullying in the workplace, most of the time, the stories in the news are going to be government ones because they get released to the public because these are like elected officials or whatnot. And it's these old dudes who grew up in the 80s where they could do whatever they want, and they always cross the line because they think they're untouchable because they've lived their whole life this way. And they are the ones who don't realize that society is changing. So the young people, again, this is sort of might be the savior of Japan, is these young people who are like in their 20s and early 30s now, who are willing to call them out and are not going to take it because they've been raised with a slightly different set of sensibilities or ideas that this isn't what work is supposed to be like. Um, so yeah, like he just brings you up, and then him berating you is one thing. And very at the beginning of our conversation, there's constructive criticism, and then there's just criticism. If you're just saying you're stupid, that's not constructive. If you're saying you're stupid in front of all your coworkers, you're trying to make them look bad. So that's a whole other thing. And then there's the sexual harassment. I still believe that this is all the old guys. This is the guys over 50 years old. Again, grew up in the 80s when Japan was just like the richest country on the planet. Uh, just they're throwing money around and there was partying and everything was okay. And the world changed and their mentality didn't. So they work with women and they don't understand that these women are not into them, don't find them attractive, don't like them. And they don't understand that their urges should not be immediately satisfied. So they cross that line and then they get in trouble. And they literally don't understand why they got in trouble. There's a story I did in Ninja News Japan, and it's a mayor, and it was 99 cases of sexual harassment, or just harassment, maybe a combination, bullying and sexual harassment. But it was 99 cases. He didn't get the like full 100 set, I guess. When he was quitting, so he didn't get fired. He said like, I'll step down. But in his stepping down speech, this is the bit I talked about the most. He literally said, I still don't really see what the problem is. Like, I don't see what I did wrong. And that's it. It's just that like this closed mentality of an older generation that isn't willing to change. Japan, in my opinion, the biggest problem they have is all their politicians are like 60, 70, 80 years old. And these are guys who they haven't changed their thinking in 40 years. They haven't updated anything. This is why they're like, oh, we need more babies. Let's just make a government program. It's like, dude, that's not, I don't know what happened back in the 60s when you were dating and stuff, but that's not how it works now. That's not how people form relationships, and they just don't understand. And then we have all these technology issues. Before the pandemic, the minister for technology turns out he didn't know how to use a smartphone. So everyone's like, well, how can you be in charge of technology if you don't know how to use a smartphone? And he's like, well, I have an assistant who does that for me. I make decisions. I don't have to understand stuff. And that to me encapsulated the whole problem of this older generation, where it's like, I don't have to understand something to be able to make a decision or give an opinion on it because I'm an older Japanese man. What I say is right. So I think, yeah, there's a generational shift. The problem is these older guys aren't letting go of their positions. And so that's holding Japan back. They have to be pushed out. They have to retire. And then these young guys, young men and women need to come up and take their place. We're getting a lot more female politicians in Japan over the last maybe 5 years, which is a huge step forward. And I think really, really important because uh, women's issues have been pushed aside for far, far too long. And when that equality and balance comes into play, I think it'll make a big difference to Japan as a society. And again, I think this is all progress and it will be significant, but it might even take like a full generation for it to happen. It might be like my kids or the people who are like turning 20 right now. They're the ones who will make that change because they're just growing up in a different world than these old people are. And these old people are holding on to a world that I think doesn't exist anymore.
I think sometimes people end up getting spoiled by how socially abiding some people might have been at times. I think even in Japan, sometimes it's frowned upon if like you're playing a game, chess, or I'm not quite sure what in Japan are,
Shogi?
but like shogi. Yeah, I was going to say that, but I was like, I don't want to be. I don't want somebody. There are people who find you on social media and correct you and be like, "Hey, you stupid."
Don't worry about it. I speak Japanese, so I mean, I'll correct your pronunciation and stuff, but I don't think
Yeah,
it's something you should like. I don't think anyone should feel bad about it. You're trying. That's all that matters.
but it's shogi. It's interesting to me how people go out of their way. Well, I should say that I find it fascinating how in Japan it's kind of frowned upon if you like beat the elders, like don't do that, don't speak up or don't speak against the plan. Rather, it is better to build upon the plan. And so I think sometimes those well-meaning paragons of how to support a group and how to understand society can sometimes be exploited by, unfortunately, scrupulous individuals. It's kind of a tell us all the time is how typical structures and ideas can often find themselves abused by very flawed and very exploitative individuals who care not for what the ideas mean, merely what power it lends them. And I think
Yeah.
that's oh good.
Oh, no, no, I was just gonna say, like, the culture shift is difficult. For me, the most difficult aspect of working in Japan was the Japanese meeting, because in the Western mindset, you have a meeting in a company, and so maybe someone will say an idea, and you'll, again, hopefully constructively criticize that idea, or maybe add to it or change it, or say, like, "Here's another idea. We'll do some brainstorming together," all that kinda stuff. In Japan, the idea has been decided, and then the meeting is just an information session to tell you what the
Hmm.
plan is. And so your input isn't welcome. And no Western person understands that at first. So your boss will sit down and be like, here's A, B, C, D. And you're like, oh, I think we should do Z. And they're like, what are you doing? They're like immediately furious. Why are you talking right now? Um, because the concept of a meeting is a different thing in both cultures. And it took me forever. I had to get in trouble like 2, 3 times before I realized, like, oh, they don't want to know what I think. If they wanted to know what I think, they would have asked me before the meeting. And then they would have taken my idea and integrated that into the plan and then presented the plan. So it took a long time to realize the meeting is before the actual group gets together. So I need to talk to my coworkers. My boss maybe wants some input. I want to throw in a proposal or two. This kind of stuff has to happen. And then the boss makes a bunch of decisions and then has a meeting and kind of just presents the idea. And so the meeting's when it's done. Whereas in the West, the meeting's sort of where it's either beginning or progressing, or you're trying to like correct. And yeah, that was a huge culture shift that no one ever explains to you until it's too late. And there's a couple of incidences like that where culturally you're just like, oh, this is just not what I thought it was. Like, we're using the same word, we're using the word meeting. This is not a Western meeting. This is a Japanese meeting, or this, I don't know what if it's the same in other countries in Asia, but it is a different thing. And so I have to figure out, okay, the work that I wanted to get done, where does that happen and when does it happen? And it all happened before the meeting. And I, at first couple of years, I was just left out of it because I thought, oh, we'll wait for the meeting and then I'll share all my brilliant ideas.
And I think it's also interesting how dissent, how honestly, it's very interesting sometimes when you watch TV shows and how they convey being chastised in some shows. Well, we find it in America, we find it kind of funny for somebody to be yelling and being loud because it's like, oh, you deserve to be yelled at. But like yelling is kind of like something that you don't see happen sometimes. It's kind of funny how most characters are just kind of glaring at somebody. There's like a quiet disapproval that happens before anything else. Like someone will pull you to the side, but it's interesting to watch that occur within like just anything. Even in the commercial I just discussed and talked about, there was just no one said anything. He's like, "Oh, I'm about to beat him," and everyone just looked at him like they conveyed it with the eyes before it without anyone saying anything like "Don't do it."
Yeah, there's a concept in Japan. It's I think it's called KY, and it means socially unaware. And so it means you don't pick up on the signals. So They have different levels of it in Japan. They There's an expectation that, yeah, like a lot of things are not said. There's sort of a feeling, and you understand the feeling and you go with it. Where again, I'm honestly pretty dense socially. So I have to have people explain stuff to me every now and then. Like I had that experience multiple times in Japan. And I was very lucky I met my wife and she understood what was going on and she would just like lean over and go, "Do this." And I would do that and it would be the right thing to do. But yeah, the social awareness is a whole other thing, because there's the city of Kyoto, which is really famous for shrines and it's super traditional. And so the idea is that people from Kyoto have a level of etiquette higher than everyone else's. So, um, one of the stories I heard, now this is a story, so it might not actually be true, but it was like, how does someone in Kyoto get you to leave? So like you've come to their house, you're having tea, having dinner or something, and they want you to leave because you've overstayed your welcome. And they're like, well, how does so people maybe make suggestions like, oh, it's getting late because they say something like that. That would be rude in Kyoto. So what they do in Kyoto is they go, oh, that's a very nice watch. And the idea is to get you to look at your watch so you realize the time. And so
That's
like
hilarious.
that level of subtlety though, that's going to go right over my head. I would never even notice that. And there's a lot of people more dense than I am. They just would be like, yeah, let me tell you all about my watch for the next 20 minutes. And the person's getting very frustrated. But that sort of, yeah, understanding the atmosphere, understanding what's going on. And again, like I trying to find out in my company, when does the actual work happen where we integrate ideas or give suggestions or stuff? I had to learn that through experimentation, essentially. And I was lucky that I had, well, I work with in a company with like a very mixed foreign and Japanese staff. So social misunderstandings are pretty normal. So they don't get particularly offended by them or very upset. But if I went and worked in a Japanese company without the experience I've had now, it would be very, very difficult to actually understand how do I be effective in my role, because I don't know actually where the work happens half the time.
I think that's a very fascinating thing, especially um, as someone who is well versed in martial arts. Um, do these disciplines, how do these disciplines, I should ask, play out in your field? Actually, was there a time period where you had, well, in terms of like hierarchies in a sense, how does that work out in martial arts? I should just ask before we just explore um,
Yeah.
simply how you got into it, what fascinated you about it, and why have you been so passionate about it for all these years? This is something I always find fascinating about people who have been diligent about.
So the hierarchy is pretty clear. It's usually some sort of experience level. So you get the belts, but in Western countries, so in Canada, when I did judo, you get white, yellow, orange, green, blue, brown, black belt. In Japan, for that's only for kids. They do color belts for kids. For adults, it's just white and black. And so you have white belts and black belts. So it's a pretty clear division most of the time. Um, Once you get into a room, you pretty quickly figure out who the highest belts are. Just it's almost again like an atmosphere. You When I walk into any sort of judo club, there's just a level of confidence that goes with it because I've walked into so many. So I'm not nervous about walking into one. And that already gives a signal like, oh, that guy kind of knows what he's doing. Because I've been doing it so long and I'm an older guy, I get deference even if I'm not as good as other guys. So he's just that level of that length of time, that dedication. Uh, I was really good. Of course, now it's a sort of decline of my life, so I'm not as good as I used to be. But there's still that knowledge base is there, and they have a lot of respect for that because I can show people really neat things that they maybe wouldn't have thought of. And I've done a lot of international competition that people who really good fighters in Japan won't have experienced yet until they get to a higher level. Whereas I just traveled around. So I got to do international competition just because I thought, oh, it'd be fun to go around and do judo in different countries. But yeah, some of the experiences I had, like one of the nicest things my teacher told me before I left Canada was like, never say you're good. Like you always say you're really bad and let them find out the hard way. Because if you go in and say you're good, then you've just put a big target on your back. Everyone wants to beat you. So I'd won a whole bunch of competitions and whatnot. When I came to Japan, they said, okay, please introduce yourself. I said, hi, I'm Chuck McBeef Chest. I've been doing judo for this long. I hurt my knee last week, so I'm really weak right now. So please be gentle with me. They were just saying that kind of stuff. And then they go, have you ever won a competition? I'm like, oh, I've done my best. You never say you actually won. And then you go out and you fight, and then they're like, "Oh, wait, pretty good." because it becomes apparent pretty quickly. Uh, so my most negative experience with the hierarchy in Japan was I had my second degree black belt when I left Canada and I came to Japan and I was like, oh, I'll do my third degree black belt test here, which is pretty interesting. At that point, I didn't really care about the levels. It was more just for the experience to do something in Japan. Like if I got a belt in Japan, that would be significant. And so I roll up to the test place. Is sort of like in Japan, it's prefectures, but I guess it would be like the state testing facility for martial arts. Um, and in Aichi, where Nagoya is, it's this really giant, impressive building. So it's really cool place to go. So I went there on this day and I up to the test. I go up to the desk and I'm like, yeah, I'm here to do my third degree black belt test because you have to do competition and then a thing called kata, which is like showing the proper form of a set of throws. And then you do a paper test, which that is a whole experience in itself because we didn't have written tests in Canada for sports, which was very weird thing to experience the first time because I couldn't read yet. So I was an illiterate person trying to do a paper test. But this old Japanese dude looks at me and he goes, "Where'd you get your black belt?" And I said, "In Canada." And he goes, "Oh, so you didn't get it in Japan?" I said, "No, I didn't." He goes, "So you don't really have a black belt?" And so he busted me down to white belt again. Now this is after
Whoa.
20 years of like literally international level experience. And so I couldn't do the test that day. I was deeply, deeply insulted. So furious. So I just walk out and then I went back to my club a couple days later and my coach walks up to me. He's like, I kind of heard what happened that they wouldn't let you take the test. And I'm like, dude, yeah, like, what do I do? And he's like, what you do is you go in there and you do it perfectly. You prove to them that they were wrong. And I was like, this is maybe the most sort of fatherly figure I've had in my life. And I was like, okay, if you say that's what we're going to do, but then I have to go put on a white belt. Now, like I said, the first part is competition. So you got to imagine the other guys are actually white belts. Like they've done 6 months of judo. So my first fight as a 6 foot, maybe 210 pounds, 20 years, 30 years experience at that point, staring down 17, 16-year-old kid who'd done judo for 6 months. He was terrified and I felt really bad for him. But really my goal at this point was to try not to hurt anybody. So they said go. And I said, like, okay, come over here and I'll just throw you. It'll be over really quick. So I did all that. I did the first level and second level of white belt in one day. And then the time had run out. So I went back and I did the black belt test. And then I did the second degree black belt test. And as I walked out, the old dude who had refused me in the first place. So now I'm back at the level I should have been. And I did it all in one go, which is insulting almost because it's like it shows how wrong they were to do this. Um, he said, like, oh, if you'd showed us your certificate, we might have accepted it. This was the closest he could come to an apology. And I didn't say anything. I just walked away because I'm like, that is absolute bullshit. I know if I'd pulled out my black belt certificate from Canada, you would not have accepted it. You were just being, and that was just an old man, had power. He's going to exercise it just because he can. But then he ended up looking bad, like, because I destroyed all the white belts and all the black belts they put out in front of me. And then we did the kata, we did the forms, and I did them perfectly because I'd done them years and years ago, many, many times with other friends. And then the paper test was the hardest part, again, because I can't read. So they had a high school teacher who also taught judo who did English. And he read the question to me, he translated it, and then I answered it. And then he wrote down the answer for me, which was very generous because they didn't actually have to do that. But I think at this point they realized, like, oh, we've really, really messed this up. Like, we've really made ourselves look bad by making this guy do this.
I do love the closest thing to apology sort of thing is that really having the ability to just say, "Hey, you know what? I might have been wrong here. I might have been
Yeah,
totally,
he couldn't do it. He could not apologize. He said he kind of backtracked, but he did not actually apologize, and I just walked away. I just was like, "No, I'm not giving you the opportunity to, if even if you could say sorry, I don't want you to do it now because this is just gone way too far."
My favorite type of almost apologies is when they try to make it seem like their actions were a byproduct of some mistake you made. Oh, well, if you'd done this and that, we would have alleviated all the confusion already. Like wrong, and now you're trying to my fault and something I need to take accountability for. Yeah, that's a definitely the creme de la creme. Piece of resistance.
Well, it was one of those ones where it's just This is humiliating, but at the same time, it was like, okay, can I do it? Yes, I can do it very easily. So just suck it up and do it. And that was again, my coach's advice was just like, show them that they're wrong, and then they won't be able to argue with you again. So I got my first degree black belt test completed in Japan. I got my second degree black belt test done in Japan. That guy can't say anything. I didn't bother with a third at that point because I was so frustrated with the system. But um, it was just like, I need to show them exactly how wrong they were so they can't ever doubt that I was right in the first place.
That's impressive, especially pointing out to them. As for what enamored you with being a practitioner?
So when I was a kid, like again, I started 10, 11, or 12, so really, really young. I think I was just a violent kid. Again, there's energy and sort of just this rage that little children feel. I had that. And there's again no reason. I didn't have a bad home life or anything. There was no reason for me to be this like ball of energy that was all furious for some reason. And so they put me into I did kickboxing first. I didn't really like getting punched in the face very much. But boxing and kickboxing, you do spend a lot of time on bags. And I didn't enjoy that. And then they put in judo because it was just very convenient for them to try. And judo, the appeal to me, I think, was that you do judo 100% all the time if you want. So you're always training against other people and you can fight as hard as you want because the whole system is designed around a certain level of safety. So like the throws, they look really harsh, but you don't do any of that until you learn how to fall down safely. So once you learn how to fall, if someone throws you, you just get up again. So if you watch the Olympics or you watch some sort of judo on the internet, you'll see these incredibly hard throws and then they both just get up again. And it's because they've learned how to fall safely. So if you can do that, then you can do this sport as hard as humanly possible. And there's a real satisfaction there. So I did some boxing. I wasn't very good at it, let's be honest. But it was a lot of hitting bags. And that's not the same as fighting a person. And then if you do kickboxing or something like that, and you do it full on sparring all the time, you're gonna get hurt. Like you're gonna get concussions, you're gonna get a broken nose, you're gonna get broken bones because you just can't do that all the time. Whereas judo, because it's designed around this idea of, okay, we're going to do throwing and tripping and falling onto the ground. And then there's a wrestling component. But if you do it as hard as you can, no one gets hurt. And so that to me was the appeal was fighting against another person using all my power and all my energy and all my technique and all my whatever I have going for me. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but you can expend all that. And then it brings sort of as I became like a teenager and I think like hormones and stuff came into play. That really helped balance me out. I found a certain peace in it. I found a certain resilience that gave me self confidence that a lot of other teens and when you get into my early 20s, they didn't have. So I had like this sort of gentle confidence around me all the time because I just, yeah, a strength of mind and body goes really far. So each aspect as I grew up built me up as a person and it felt like it made me better. So I just kept going. And so when you talk about like how what made you dedicate yourself to it was like I never saw a detriment to myself or my life by trying to push to the next level in this thing.
That is a quite a succinct way to answer the question. Yeah, I think in terms of I think it's definitely that passion, the ambition that I think people love to express in healthy ways, especially when it comes to competitiveness, and I think that exudes in other ways. And as somebody who did do boxing for quite a short period of time, it was fun for me. But whenever I started to take it more seriously, I think I had instance where we were just training and boxing, and we were competing as just amateurs, and the amount of bruising on my face, I was just like, no, I'm just I'm not I don't think I'm a fan of this. I don't think my irritation was I knew that it wasn't for me personally because after everything had occurred and the fight was over, my agitation didn't reside, like how angry I got after everything had occurred. I'm like, "No, I do not have a calm in my spirit after all this has happened." So, I just hang the gloves up and I just enjoy so many other things as writing literature and all that, and so I never decided to pursue it any further, and plus, the amount of harm and hurt that people are constantly trying to put you in front of is not my cup of tea.
Oh, but that's kind of my point. Like, you cannot sustain a high level and not get injured. And that those injuries, they're cumulative. Like that can negatively impact. Like, I have lots of injuries from judo, and I can tell, like, my left hand, my little finger in the what my ring finger next to it, they don't close all the way and stuff, and like my knees ache. That is from a lifetime of doing it. But if I think I was in a different sport, I think I would be immobile at this point, because that the damage, it's never really goes away. It's all accumulates over time. So I got really into ice baths, maybe 2 years ago, to just deal with inflammation, which is a constant problem if you're doing sort of any sort of combat sport. And they're unpleasant, but afterwards the results are really nice. And the thing is, you really got to think about that. And I would actually say, like, judo compared to other combat sports does less damage. Like, I think you get a lot of bruises, but bruises heal just fine, and you get a lot of, like, calluses and stuff, but those are superficial. Whereas I think, like, again, boxing, if we're going to talk about boxing, like, it's you've got a concussion if you've been hit in the head a couple times, and that can happen 3, 4 times in one match. So, like, you could actually end up with basically multiple concussions in 1, 2, 3 minute period. And I just, like, I don't see how that's sustainable over a lifetime. So that's, maybe there's a balance there. Like, if I'd taken a different sport, maybe I would have had to quit by now. Whereas because I did judo, and I feel like judo is very sustainable, I was able to continue all through my life. And I mean, I'm 52 now. I'm still going. I teach classes. I still train. Like, I still actually practice and fight with the other guys. I don't see any reason why I would stop unless there's, like, a debilitating injury, but I wouldn't see that coming from judo. I would actually, like, oh, I was in a car accident or something, and something else happened, and that negatively impacted my ability to. But if it goes the way it is now, like, my teacher is in his 70s. He doesn't really practice anymore, but he's still a very physically capable man. Like, you can see he doesn't have any limps or injuries or things that sustain him, and he's active, and he's bright, and, like, you can see his mind is working, and so he's very active. And again, he's around all these young people all the time, which I think also really elevates his spirit, because I wasn't losing interest, but I was getting kind of bored. I was fighting the same guys every week. It's like, I'm going to fight that guy and I'm going to win. I'm going to fight that guy. Oh, he's really strong. It's going to be really tough. Like, it's predictive, because the same people come every week. So when I started bringing in, so we would have foreign people who would join my company, and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm interested in judo." I'm like, "Well, then come out." And I ended up with a little mini foreigner class of my own that I was able to teach, and they got really excited. That excitement was infectious to me, and that really, really kept me going, because we had a guy join a little while ago, and he's done about 10 sessions of judo, and then he's like, "I want to join a competition," because there was a competition coming up. My teacher was like, "Do you want to join?" And I kind of quit competition when I was in my 40s, because I was taking it too seriously, and I get super stressed out. But this guy wanted to do it, and I'm like, "Dude, you've only done like 10. You're gonna get killed." And he's like, "Yeah, I want to do it." I'm like, "Okay, we're gonna focus on the 3 things you need to win." And he went into the tournament. It was all black belts, and he was a white belt. He lost 2, he tied 2, and he won 2. And I mean, as a result, that is amazing. Like, this guy has just fully exceeded every expectation I could have had. I just assumed he was going to lose every fight because they were all black belts, but he took the 3 things I decided to focus on, which was 2 throws and 1 thing to do on the ground when you wrestle. It was an arm lock, because I'm like, you have to finish quick. You can't spend time with these guys, because then they'll figure out what they can and can't do. You have to get them to the ground. If they're on the ground, you have to do this move. And he did it. And so 1 throw was perfect, and he won. And then took a guy to the ground. He did the arm lock, and he won. And I was just like, that was more exciting for me than it probably was for him, or maybe the same, because I was feeling this rush of satisfaction of, like, I had to come up with a plan over a couple of weeks to get this guy so that he could survive this thing. And then he didn't only survive, he exceeded. So I felt like I've achieved something by him doing very well.
I do love there's one thing, being someone who's been in physical sports, whether that be boxing, a little bit of basketball, and a small bit of football. CTC is no joke in terms of like the damage it can cause, and you can accrue over your body for a long period of time. Some of the small period of time periods and injuries I've gotten, I can't imagine somebody who's been doing it for more than a decade, for years on end. I think that there's a safety to martial arts in a way, you guys do practice them, and there is harm obviously that can transpire, but it's lesser degree, orders of magnitude. Another thing I wanted to bring up is that watching somebody is so interesting, refreshing because it's a conversation without words. It's a moment where both fighters are trying to figure each other out, are trying to interact with each other, trying to figure out what is okay, what can they get away with, what is allowed. And what you spoke towards hit that right in the head when you said the longer the fight transpires for, the more your weaknesses are highlighted to the other individual, the more they'll start to notice exploit and what they can capitalize, what you do not want as a fighter. So I
Yeah.
find it like
Um,
good.
this guy has been again, he's only come for a few months now, and so he practiced with me primarily so I can show him stuff because he hasn't gotten to the point where he can really just sort of like free roam and go fight a bunch of random people. But he says that when we practice, every now and then I'll just like close my eyes, and he finds that really frustrating because he knows that's when I'm going to throw him, and it's because I didn't realize I do this, and the reason I close my eyes is because I don't want to look at his body. I want to feel where he is and where he's going so that I can make a move that's really smooth. And he's like, you close your eyes for like 30 seconds and I know it's coming. And he's like, and the most annoying part is I know I can't stop it. But it's just that
That's hilarious.
experience
That's
level. Yeah,
that's really
it's
like
frustrating for him. I feel bad for him because it's almost insulting, but he's like, no, I know what you're doing. You're like trying to just feel the right moment, but it's very frustrating as a new person and he can't stop it. Like it'll come. Like, he's very young and he's very physically capable. So I give him like 6 months and he'll be throwing me around the room maybe.
also, there are instances in, martial arts where there's a moment of tapping out, like, "Okay, we're done here. We're not going any further. We're not pursue this any further." I like those moments as well, and I think, one of my favorite things about martial arts in general is that there's a heavier emphasis on discipline than brutality. Sometimes it feels as though sometimes even boxing has a very emphasis on power, but you notice that, like, some of the biggest, um boxers are an elite class of people who are skilled at being technical. They're not just powerful boxers. They are understanding jabs, crosses, when to lean in, lean out, disciplined uses of their length in a fight, knowing when to dip out, which is why I'm a big fan of Mayweather, despite his braggadocious way of displaying himself. He is an exceptional boxer.
Yeah, the respect goes a long way for me, and I think that's in judo specific. They talk about respect just being like a certain amount of humility. They try to build up that culture. They talk a lot about taking care of your partner, like your opponent, because if you injure your opponent, he won't be able to come back and practice with you. So keeping him safe is just as important because that means that's your progress. So yeah, maybe I want to throw him, but if I throw him dirty and he gets hurt, he's not coming back for 6 weeks because he's injured. Now I don't have anyone to practice with who can actually challenge me. So I don't want to do a dirty move. I don't want to do a move that could like actually endanger my partner because that will impede my progress and my improvement. And so that's a very interesting way of looking at it. So if you're going to take a bad fall, basically in judo, I would rather push myself into a bad position so that my partner is safe than actually hurt myself because then at least then my partner is okay.
I think that's very insightful actually. It gives me a new perspective of why if you perceive your person in that manner, why would you want to harm them? Why would you would want to make sure that after the match is done or even during the match that you want to make sure that both of y'all come back in pristine condition. Like no one is harmed beyond what is necessary to win.
Yeah, there's always going to be bruises again and again, superficial. They go away in a week or two, no problem. But you, if you like get rough and you hurt people and stuff, you're just going to run out of partners, and then you're not going to ever get better. Whereas those guys who are practicing together, maybe they were below you before, they're going to surpass you by being able to continue practicing all the time. And that is a very interesting way. I think that's a very unique judo way of looking at the person you're practicing with because people come in and see you as an opponent. It's like, okay, I don't want to fight you again. So maybe I'll practice with you once or twice, but it's like, you're dangerous or you're not worth it. I don't want to have practice, which means you're never going to learn my cool moves. You're never going to learn the things I've learned. You're never going to learn how to beat me, which means your progress stops. And I don't want anyone else to have that feeling towards me either. So that sort of level of kindness, there's always like stereotypes about different groups. And so, like, the classic is the jock is very dumb. I think that's a pretty standard Western one. In Japan, the stereotype for judo guys is that they're very kind. So they're not smart or stupid. They're kind, which I always found was a very interesting thing. When you look at what they're doing, again, it's fighting. It's pretty scary. It's pretty dangerous for a lot of people. But then they come out and it's like, oh, it's a judo guy. He's very nice. They're always really kind people. I was like, it's because they do foster that mentality in the martial art itself.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things I've noticed about Japan in general is that there is a communal nature to a lot of ways that the society operates. Well, America has a hyper individualism of making a name for yourself, your personhood, your legacy, who are you as a person, and that the valuation uniquely plays out in how ambitious a lot of Americans often are at times. I do love the fact that there is a communal nature to a lot of what transpires and a evaluation of your actions and behaviors through the magnitude of knowing that when you introduce yourself to another individual, they are using your last name. So it makes you more conscientious as to how you operate within that system. While more people more intimately know you, use your first name, people who just begin to know you, they know you as your last name. So it makes you more accountable to your behavior because your behavior is not just affecting you, it's affecting everybody who has your last name. I think I just love that facet. And even if it plays out in what you were talking about earlier, is like you're not just fighting for you, you're fighting to ensure that they are not being harmed and you can both progress in a way that pushes both of y'all forward. And with that in mind, I'm no longer looking at it as I just need a win. I'm thinking as like, let's get home, let's get back safe. Let's do what we can to ensure that we put on a show. But for the sake of sportsmanship, I wouldn't want anything harm to come to you. It's just that sort of bonding language that I just enjoy from Japan and in general in terms of culturally.
Yeah, I've found that in judo all over the world though. So like I practiced in Canada, I practiced in America, I went around Europe. I have family in Europe, in Ireland, so I went to Ireland and England and Spain and France, and I practiced there. And then I went to Korea, and then I went to Japan. And I found this was sort of a universal in this group, was this like, yeah. So you come in, you join the club, and now you're just a member, and it is a family kind of feeling. Like it's like, okay, you're one of us now. I mean, when I was in Korea, yeah, only white guy in the club, but they're like, you're one of us. How old are you? We're the same age. Okay, we're best friends now. Like, and then now let's try to kill each other for 5 minutes. Great, that was super fun, and that there was no. I mean, I think you get again sort of individuals who have the wrong mentality, but I actually find that they drop out fairly quickly because they get frustrated. Whereas overall, my overall experience, I think, is pretty universal. Where there is a level of care and kindness towards the other people who are doing the judo with you.
Understandable. I think that obviously being part of a community such as the one you're describing here definitely brings, especially if you're finding it out external to other places, no matter where you're traveling to. To correct myself, I should separate the distinction that, exclusively speaking, as somebody a part of that martial arts, I think it's good that that community exclusively does that for each other. But I was also separate independent of that. I just think that that decorum is also important for Japanese culture. And but yeah, speaking towards um, in terms of being how long you've been doing this for quite some time. Um, do you have is there any particular fight or exhibition that stands out in your mind as being some of your hardest bouts? Or
Yeah, because Japan, a lot of the competitions don't have weight categories. So like I said, I'm what 90 kilos. So that's like 200 pounds or 210 pounds. So I'm a big boy. But there's bigger guys out there. In Japan, one of my most memorable fights was one I lost. And it was interesting because judo match at that time, I think they set it for 5 minutes. The guy was bigger than me. Like I went up to his shoulder and he was just much bulkier and stronger than I was. And we fought the entire time. We went and I managed to get him to the ground and I got him into a hold down. And in the hold down at that time again was 30 seconds, hold him on his back. And he, I got to about 10 or 15 seconds. And then just the end of that 5 minutes, I just ran out of gas. and he basically just rolled over, and then he was on top and he won the match. But afterwards, so he got the gold, I got the silver. Afterwards, he just turned around and he goes, "You won that fight." And I was like, "Oh, dude, thank you so much." Because it was so frustrating to fight a guy much bigger than me for 5 minutes straight and lose because I had him and the strength just drained from me. Like there was just nothing left. And that was the hardest one silver I ever got, I think. There was when I was trying to get into the nationals in Canada. Um, so you've probably watched a lot of martial arts movies. The traditional martial arts movie has a very set uh, plot structure where the final fight, the hero gets injured, and usually they tape it up, or they do like the Karate Kitty did some magic hands or something, and then they go back out and with their spirit and their will and their heart, they go back out and they do like a special move and win the fight. And so I was in a very high level match, and this my opponent had, I'm going to say accidentally. A lot of people that I know are they would say it was on purpose. He took two of my fingers and pulled them backwards. Now, it happened, broke my two fingers. So I went off the mats, I taped them up, and I went back out. Now, in the movie, that sort of strength of spirit is what would have carried me through. Reality has a different idea of how things work. I got whooped in about 10 seconds flat because you can't do a thing like judo with only one hand. You need both hands. Uh, and yeah, reality set in, and so like I walked off, and there were tears and stuff. But then, yeah, I realized that movies had lied to me, so that was a tough lesson to learn. I'm trying to think of any other ones, but those were the two biggest ones. Because one, that was that one where I broke my hand was the end of my career. Like essentially, I was not going to go to a higher level anymore. But coming to Japan, I'd learned that there was like a different almost spirit to it. So again, that guy, he'd won gold. He could have rubbed it in my face. He could have been difficult about it. He was really generous with his feeling. He was like, "Dude, you won. You did that whole thing." And the taking away weight categories was an interesting thing because I would fight guys much smaller than me, but the guys who are smaller than me, they're much faster. So I have to change my tactics because they're serious. They want to throw the bigger guy just as much as I wanted to throw the bigger guy. So I learned from them, okay, when you're fighting someone bigger than you got to move around, you got to be faster, you got to try to tire them out. I just happened to use all my fuel in that match, and it didn't quite work out. But I just remember the level of satisfaction I had, even in losing, about how hard I tried. And that was good enough. It was success in its own way because I just did something that was essentially impossible. Like I just beat someone. He was just as good as me skill wise. He was bigger and stronger. So all I had was, yeah, do my best and maybe I'll have a chance. And I had more than a chance. I actually like took it to the line, which was really great.
I guess the common narrative of the indomitable spirit, like, he threw shards of glass in my eyes. Now I become the blind sense, a person who can have sensory awareness that has elevated to the gods. I'm like, as someone who's, yes, like, I think the only thing I've ever had happen is, I've only had my hamstring pull, and I'm like, I can handle the rest of this match. And I'm like, wow, not being able to really move in a boxing match, it really means you're just getting
You're just standing there getting
mauled.
punched. Yeah, yeah. No, I've pulled a hamstring as well. You don't walk after that. You just gotta like, oh, maybe you just walk. You're not gonna run or anything else. You just try to walk it off. But yeah, I pulled a hamstring, maybe last year, and oh, the bruise on that was dramatic.
Yeah, be thinking the indomitable spirit. Nope, not not.
Nah, real life doesn't care about that at all. Yeah, it's one of those things where, but I mean, those two experiences are parallel because one, I did try and I lost and it was really painful. But the other one, I tried and yeah, I still lost, but I felt really good because there was no giving up. And in both instances, one, it was because of an injury and it felt like it was kind of out of my hands, out of my control. In the other one, there was a feeling that I did everything I could do. And yes, he won, but he had a certain amount of respect for me at the end of that he was going to take me seriously from that point on. And he was super friendly about it. And again, that kind of goes back to the like, there's no resentment. And I don't resent him winning. I was just like, I could have done more, but it was all on my side, not him.
Another thing, since we're going to be winding down soon, a couple of questions that I know our audience might be interested in hearing about. What are some misconceptions about living in Japan that you believe people have in their mind when they think about moving or even visiting for long periods of time?
Uh, it's really gonna depend on the type of person. So it's like I always bring it back to the anime guy because I think it's the most dramatic version of this experience where they think everyone in Japan is into to the same degree they are. And I know every anime person I've met who's come to Japan is so much deeper into it than a normal person would be. And that's not an insult. They're just so into it. The expectation that like other people even know the anime they talk about is unreasonable. And that's a bit of a shock the first couple of times they talk to people and they're like, "Oh, do you know this?" And there's like, "I have no." They're like, "But it's from Japan. It's from your culture." It's like, yeah, but no one knows every single aspect of their own culture. So there's that expectation is already wrong. Uh, there's people who come and they don't think that Japan is there's either a dichotomy of it's super advanced or super ancient at the same time, and Japan does have a very strange mix. Um, there's a lot of very modern buildings and a lot of very modern stuff, but I would actually say the average living experience is pretty poor. I have a house. I own a house. I come from Canada, where if you do not have central heating, like rooms will freeze. Like it just gets that cold in certain places in Canada. Japan, because of the culture of earthquakes, has impacted how they build houses. So houses don't get resold. So after a house is so old, they're like, ah, it's not up to sort of scratch earthquake proof wise. So we're going to tear it down and build a new house. So you don't buy used houses. So they're made slightly more cheaply. They don't really have insulation in the way a Western person would know it. Each room is heated and cooled individually, which is very frustrating because my room that I'm in right now, it's my little bedroom, has a air conditioner at the top. It does heat and cooling. So the cooler is on right now. If I go out into my own hallway, it's 10 degrees hotter and I'll immediately start sweating. And that is a constant level of discomfort in the summertime for me because again, from Canada, I'm used to it being cooler overall that I was not ready for. When I came to Japan, it was September, and I came from Vancouver, which is a very cool place in the summer and winter. Like it's never super cold, never super hot. So I'd kind of gotten used to that. In September, it was still 30 degrees Celsius. I don't know what Fahrenheit, um, but it's probably in the 90s. It's very hot and it's very humid. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and I lost about 20 pounds over a couple of weeks because of I just was not ready for this temperature change because my image of Japan wasn't actually humid and hot. And there's areas where you go a little bit south from where I live and there's palm trees and stuff. The humidity is insane. And so the weather, the typhoons, there's typhoon season. They have a crazy amount of seasonal changes. So that living condition was shocking because I was like, how poor is the building and the housing and the living situation? It's so uncomfortable so often. Um, so that was a big shock for me. I'm trying to think culturally though, but what they run into. I think they run into a lot of Western people get confused. Like they don't know that it's changed. When I came, packaging was a big problem. Like everything was individually wrapped because Japanese people are so concerned about cleanliness. And so that's improved, but it's still not good. So a lot of like certainly Canadians come over and they're very conscious about recycling and stuff, and they get infuriated at how much packaging is on everything, which I agree with. But it's important to just try to recycle as much plastic as you can in Japan because they use so much plastic. It's terrifying. And then you run into sort of just like we were talking earlier, ideological differences of culture that are unfathomable because you don't understand them because you have to learn about what's actually going on before you can actually understand. And then the second step is to integrate. And a lot of people don't get to that second stage because you find a lot of foreign people. Again, most of the people they come over to teach English for a couple of years. They end up spending all their time with other foreign people. They go out to bars. They've created this insular expatriate society within Japan, and they don't really experience it as much. Whereas because I think this is where judo was a big benefit. I came here for judo. I was immediately integrated into a group where I was the only foreign person. So I had to learn a lot about Japanese culture so that I could integrate with these guys and function. And that meant I was going out with them. So I was going out with all Japanese people and then talking to other people who are all Japanese. So I was learning those. I was doing the social faux pas, like I was making mistakes, absolutely. But they understood and they were teaching and they were friendly and they took me. So I have a better understanding now. Whereas there are groups of people, foreigners who come to Japan. They almost exclusively hang out with other foreigners. Uh, they drink, they party, they have a good time. And I'm happy they have a good time in Japan. And then they go back. I don't know if they actually ever really experience.
Sorry, my microphone just had a brief cut off, but thank you for
No,
sharing all that. In terms of, well, primarily your show, what can people expect from it? And in terms of the topics you touch on, what do you think you provide exceptionally for your perspective residing in Japan? Just for
uh,
ones of the viewers, since I want to link them and assure them to go check out your show. So this is the part of the show that I really want people to know about it.
yeah, so the biggest show that I do is Ninja News Japan. So if you just search for Ninja News Japan on sort of any podcast thing, you'll be able to find it. It is I take every week news stories from the week. I give you the breakdown of the news story. I will try to give some cultural insight if there is some cultural insight to give, but I do very much give my own opinion and I talk about what I think and feel. So it is any issue that comes up in the news. So it's going to be social issues, it's going to be culture issues, it's going to be integration, it's going to be all that kind of stuff. And then my experience, my editorialization comes from my experience as someone who is still a foreigner, so always kind of separate, but has lived here long enough that I have a base understanding of what's going on as well. So you get kind of that dual view, hopefully. And I do also try to make it funny. Like I try to put in some humor and what I'm talking about. Lately, what I've been doing is actually having listeners come on and I'll break the story into, I'll give you a bit of the story and then we do a quiz and just try to do some interplay that way to try to make it more fun. C. McBee is another podcast I do. It is fundamentally random in what I'm talking about because it's whatever I want to talk about that's interesting in the moment. So the last episode I did was the morality of Skeletor. Is he an immoral person, and how immoral is he? Where actually, I'm trying to remember what the episode before that because they were really different. Ah, the episode before that, I did two stories about two murders that happened in Japan. And then the episode before that, I was talking about gravity. So you can see like the topic spread is completely random. So you're just going to be getting like, okay, well, here's something that's so murder is pretty serious. I'm actually going through the story. I'm going through like what's happened and what's happening with these murder cases. It's essentially a true crime podcast. The one immediately following that is just ridiculous. It's talking about Skeletor, the bad guy from He, and how bad is he really? I mentioned at the beginning, C. McBee IMDb. If you remember the old show Mystery Science Theater or Riff Tracks or anything like that, essentially I watch a movie that's pretty old, mostly kung fu movies, and I do joke commentary over top. And so those are sort of the three big main projects I do. If you go to Linktree, Chuck McBeef Chest, you're just going to get a massive list of all the stuff I did. Last year I did a choose your own adventure in audio form because I've always enjoyed writing. I've always enjoyed choose your own adventures. I was like, I'll make my own. It's really silly. So all the choices are kind of arbitrary, but it's just to give you really random experiences throughout the journey that hopefully you go through.
Wow, that's a diverse list of things that people can now listen to. As someone who enjoyed Skeletor's iconic line from the reboot of the series, and someone who's an avid enjoyer of voice actors, one of my favorite lines from the early 2000s re-envisioned version of He-Man was when Skeletor gives back He-Man his father, and on the edge of a cliff, he goes, "Oh, and He-Man slide," and he just zaps the cliff, and they go falling. It's one of my favorite scenes.
Well, it turns
Again,
out like when I actually did a little bit of research, Skeletor turns out to be a fascinating character because they did not build a consistent backstory for him. So this was back when they had the toy came first and then the cartoon. And then the toy came with a little card, and the little card was supposed to be the background, but the background for Skeletor was just demon from another dimension. And when they started the show, they changed it. And then when they rebooted, they changed it again. So it actually became very unclear or very clear that no one actually knew what Skeletor was ever supposed to be in the first place.
That's actually quite fascinating, especially um, in terms of modes and creating like characters. I've always found that to be pretty interesting, and how they even try to decide to like how they go about creating characters now. Even the new Netflix special of He-Man decided to show all the He-Mans and all the people who have passed down the gauntlet. Decided to have one of them just basically be the concept art for He-Man, and I love when people do that. Decide to do that, like the OG He-Man was one of the concept arts for the initial designs, and so I love when TV shows do. And I also hope that people get to watch that, and definitely I would highly encourage you check that out since I'm a fan of He-Man, and if there ever comes a day where I can nerd out about any particular subject matter, you might see me chat up Chunk here or somewhere else. But thank you again. I cannot appreciate it enough for you joining me on this episode. Any social medias you'd like to shout out?
If you literally just go on, because Chuck McBeef Chest is such a unique name, if you just go on Google and type in Chuck McBeef Chest, you'll get the Twitter, you'll get the Instagram. I don't really post that much to social media because I spend all my time actually making stuff. So it's the podcast and the YouTube channel is where you actually would find anything that would actually be worth doing. But what I really want more than anything else is people to like react and respond and give me comments and stuff that I can talk about, because just like the conversation we just had, every prompt sets me off, and that's actually the most enjoyable part of doing.
Same for me, actually. I genuinely enjoy how people go off the beaten path for podcasting. As for this episode, I appreciate all of you watching. Thank you. And this has been another episode of Requiem Radio. You've seen this all in HD. Peace.